I was really grateful to be part of the Generosity Project Fall Edition, the great Christmas tree giveaway yesterday. And one of the things that I sensed was just a growing trust in the community in us. Was I talked to people, some of whom had been at one of the Christmas tree giveaways, and as I talked to people that I had invited, I just sensed, so you might say, well, don't a lot of churches do fall festivals? Well, we didn't see yesterday as a fall festival. We saw it striking a more unexpected chord, which is that it is good for churches to lead with generosity. That's unexpected. And it also makes a place in people's hearts for them to receive the free gift of God in Christ Jesus. And so I sensed that there was something happening yesterday, and I sort of tie it even to one day when we are able to have a home base there all the time with the first facility, that we are tilling the soil for that day. We are building trust, and we want to really guard that trust. But it was a lovely, something happened yesterday that was way bigger than us, I felt. And so I'm just really grateful to the team that put it together, all of you who participated yesterday, and grateful to God. We're in a sermon series called The Good Life, by which we mean in America a flourishing life. A good life is a flourishing life. Everybody wants to have a flourishing life. And in this series, we're reimagining the good life within the story of God. So there are different assumptions about the good life. Assumptions like the source or scope of the good life, or what gives life meaning. And each week we're taking a new assumption and we're reimagining it within the story of God. So today our assumption relates to strength and weakness. Now, everybody knows in America that strong is good and weak is bad. We want to develop our strengths and avoid weakness. Parents and teachers teach us this from an early age. Find what you're good at. Take a strength finder test. And I think in the suburbs, we get really good at presenting our strengths. There are lots of key indicators. There's appearance, and there's possessions, and there's vocational accomplishments. And there's what we know and how articulate we are. You can just go down the list. For example, unthinkingly, I think I go into the world each day, and many of you go into the world each day, and we think to ourselves, I have to let a lot of people know what I know. So a conversation goes, somebody tells me what they know, and that becomes an occasion for me to tell them what I know. And so back and forth we go. So then, where do your kids go to school? Well, my kids go to Harvard. Not really, but you get the idea. Really? Mine do too. My kids go to Harvard, your kids go to Harvard, all God's suburban children go to Harvard. You get the point. Not really. I'm exaggerating. But we promote our strengths. And so we say, well, my kids started walking at 18 months. Well, that's an occasion for you to say, what? When your kids started walking? Well, my kids started walking at 17 months, 29 days. We're all promoting our strengths. It's way more subtle than that, but we think that the game is to move from strength to strength. What do you do for a living? Well, we try to spin our answer to that, right? It's never just, what do we do for a living? We spin that thing so it's as strongly put as possible. This is so silly. I was out running last night, and I rounded the corner, and I saw a couple walking, and I'm a long way from home. I'm not in my neighborhood, so these are people I will never see again. So what did I do? I sped up. I wanted to just glide on by those folks. So I think, in my mind, I'm thinking, I want them to think, wow, that guy's really running fast. So in other words, all of humanity is an opportunity for me to demonstrate my strength. Now, I'm not proud of that example, But you know what I'm talking about. Why can't we have people over when the house is a mess or go outside without our makeup on? I had a friend whose customary greeting to me was, "Are you winning?" And this was when I was doing a PhD, and I didn't feel like I was winning. And I didn't like his question, so he'd ask me, "Are you winning?" And I never knew what to say because I never thought I was winning. But I felt like that question is the question that we're asking in the suburban narrative. You know, only the strong survive. Sometimes I feel, and I wonder if you feel, that suburban living is this grand contest where we're all trying to prove how strong we are. Do you ever feel that way? It's just this contest back and forth. I'm strong here, you're strong there. Well, I'm strong here. But the problem is, what happens when we're not? What happens when we are weak and our lives are discouraging or disappointing? I think in the suburbs, this is when we go into hiding. We hide. So we try our best to put our best foot forward, but we also go into hiding behind our masks. And on the inside, we default to despair or self-condemnation or feeling like we've been left out. Or maybe we even opt out of life altogether. In a way, we opt out of the game. And if we're Christians, maybe we get mad at God. God, why aren't you giving me the good life? I think many of our theologies is that when we receive Jesus by faith, that means we can co-opt God's strength into our personal plan for our lives. So now we have more strength. We have God's heft added to our personal plan for our lives. And when something happens that's discouraging or disappointing, we say to ourselves, well, God, what gives? So the question we're asking today is, how's it going in the suburban, to the extent that we're all in the suburban narrative of feeling like we have to live from strength to strength? How's it going? So today's message is really about what do we do in the face of discouragement. This summer, I read 2 Corinthians. It's one of the books that I was led to during this first part of my sabbatical. And I think it's because sometimes I just get tired of playing the strength game. And I found 2 Corinthians like a soothing balm because the message of 2 Corinthians is strength in weakness. It's not strength in strength. I think I have to live a powerfully strong life. It's strength in weakness. What does it mean to live a powerfully weak life? And it's so counterintuitive and countercultural. So this is where we want to spend a little time this morning. The author of 2 Corinthians is Paul. Paul is a Christian when he writes this letter, but before Paul became a Christian, he was a rising star in the Jewish world. In Philippians 3, verses 4 to 6, Paul writes about himself, if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law of Pharisee, as to zeal a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. That's Paul's story. By all counts, Paul was a massive intellect. Scholars will say if Paul hadn't become a Christian, he would still have been one of the most influential people in the Western world. Paul was educated, talented, and credentialed. He had everything going for him in the conventional narrative of his day. And yet in Philippians 3, he says, I gave it all up because of what he was learning about strength and weakness. So today's reading is 2 Corinthians 12, 1-2. And it's in your worship guide, and I'm just going to ask you to take out your worship guide and look at it with me. The backdrop is opposition Paul was experiencing. God had called Paul to plant churches. That's what it means to be an apostle. Paul was sent to plant churches around the ancient Near East. But there were some other apostles who opposed him. Paul calls them super apostles. The phrase in Greek is actually huper apostoles, so huper apostles or super apostles. They were super apostles because they took pride in their Jewish ancestry. They prided themselves in their speaking ability. They stressed the importance of having experienced visions and revelations from God, which they saw as the mark of a true apostle. But Paul thought they preached a false gospel. And they opposed Paul because they thought he lacked the signs of a true apostle. For example, the super apostles criticized Paul for being an unimpressive speaker. 2 Corinthians 11:6. And my goodness, when they learned that Paul had experienced shipwreck and imprisonment and floggings within one lash of death, the super apostles just thought that kind of suffering and misadventure really disqualified him from being an apostle because he was so weak. So 2 Corinthians 12, 1 to 10 is a portion of Paul's answer to the super apostles. The context is boasting. Paul writes, well, I must go on boasting. Now, the super apostles have been boasting, and reluctantly Paul tries to meet them on their own terms. And so he says reluctantly, okay, I'll boast, though there is nothing to be gained by it. I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. So recall, this is one of their credentials of a true apostle. Paul says, I know a man. Now, Paul writes in the third person, but the contextual clues reveals he's talking about himself. So he says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. Kent Hughes says the biblical Jewish cosmology viewed heaven with multiple tiers. The first heaven is the atmosphere. The second heaven is the stars. The third heaven is the place God lives. Verse 3. I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. So paradise is a parallel way to depict heaven in the Bible. And again, the emphasis is on the flourishing place where God dwells. So verse 5, on behalf of this man I will boast, but on my behalf I will not boast except of my weakness. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth, but I refrain from it so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So the super apostles are bragging, but Paul has embraced strength and weakness. So he's so reluctant to brag, he writes in the third person to distance himself from his bragging. Because Paul is trying to make a point. I've learned the power of weakness instead. So some of you know the name Chuck Colson. And he served in President Nixon's cabinet. And when Nixon resigned, later Colson was actually convicted for crimes. And he went to prison. He became a Christian in prison. And he writes this about his life looking back. He said, so Colson was a very accomplished man. He says, the great paradox of my life is that every time I walk into a prison and see the faces of men or women who have been transformed by the power of the living God, I realize that the thing God has chosen to use in my life is none of the successes, achievements, degrees, awards, honors, or cases I won before the Supreme Court. That's not what God's using in my life. What God is using in my life to touch the lives of literally thousands of other people is the fact that I was a convict and went to prison. That was my great defeat, and this is what God is using. So I thought, what if I started the sermon this morning and I said, well, my name is Nelson Ould, and I'm lead pastor, and I'd like to tell you a little about myself. What would you expect next? Well, what if I went on to say, I'm not really everything I try to make you think that I am. I procrastinate, and I form my identity in work. And I'm a lot more fearful and angry than I wish I was. And many days I get very, very discouraged and feel like I'm just not enough. What if I were to start out the message that way? See, these super apostles think Christianity means moving from strength to strength. And Paul says, if we're going to have a bragging match, we're going to start with weakness. So let's go on. Verse 7. So Paul says, so to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. Now, nobody knows what the thorn was, and probably by God's design, so we could all find our way into the story. Some people have argued the thorn was his opposition from the super apostles or the Judaizers. Others have argued his thorn was some specific ailment like poor eyesight. Galatians 6:11 says Paul wrote with very large handwriting. So everybody here has some weakness of character, some deficit in your gifting, some event that's happened to you that you're suffering from right now, some frailty of your body that you wouldn't desire. And all of these are opportunities to keep us dependent on God. It strikes me, so it's so interesting that Paul commends thorns and not third heaven experiences. And it strikes me that it's thorns, not third heaven experiences, that drive us to our knees in prayer. And Paul would say qualifies him to be a true apostle. Now he says sometimes Satan will attach messages to our thorns. So the message might be, I have a thorn, I have a weakness, I have something I'm not proud of, I have something I wish was different. And the message Satan might send and attach to that thorn is, you're not enough. You'll never amount to anything, and nobody will ever love you. So these are messages Satan attaches to thorns that God has given you, but these messages are not from God. So Paul writes, verse 8, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that the thorn should leave me. Verse 9, but God said to me, and this is it, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. See, do you see what's happening here? Paul is discipling us. He's discipling us in our suburban good life narrative. He's discipling us that the good life is not living from strength to strength. In the midst of our weakness, there is his grace. So in the American narrative, we think that the only place we have to go in weakness is into shame, self-condemnation, and hiding. But Paul says Christ invites you into his grace. So what is grace? Grace is unmerited favor. Where does Paul see God's enduring grace? He sees it at the cross. So Paul writes in another place in his letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 1, verse 22, he says, Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach, you know the rest of this? Christ crucified. And then he says, people will look at that. He said it's a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. And, ironically, it's true that the cross seemed like a weak moment in salvation history. Everybody thought the mission was a failure at that moment. Just like when you encounter something weak or discouraging or disappointing about you, you think it's over. But this, ironically, is where the good news is. But he says, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. So what happened at the cross? Jesus entered into our sin and weakness. He became our sin and weakness. So we would never again have to doubt that we live in God's favor. And then he resurrected from the dead. And so what he's trying to say is, if the power of Christ rests on you in your weakness, then you are reconciled to the Father with all the spiritual inheritance of God's sons, his sons and daughters, and you share in his resurrection life. So you want the good life? Let me tell you about the good life. The good life is found through strength and weakness. So nobody sees it this way. Nobody looks at the cross and sees God's beauty, just as you don't tend to look at your disappointments and discouragement and to see the opportunity for the redeemed life. So what Paul is commending, so Paul is discipling us, and what he's commending is the cruciform life. The cruciform life is the good life. This is the paradox. So let's finish the passage. He says in verse 9, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness." And you've got to hear the good news here. You've just got to hear the good news of God. This is the gospel. He says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Because he's saying that you don't have to play the strength game anymore. Are you tired of that? Do you feel in your heart of hearts that you can't keep that up? He's saying there's another way. My strength is sufficient for you, therefore I will boast all the more gladly in my weakness. So my attitude has completely changed about my discouragement. And then he says, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Verse 10, for the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities, for when I am weak, then I am strong. It's a lovely moment. So do you hear what Paul is saying? So he uses this word. He says, now I'm content in my weakness. And I studied that word a little this week. The NIV uses the word delighted. I'm now delighted in my weakness. And I came to conclude that's a little too strong. That falls over into a place I don't think we need to go. The NLT uses the word well content. And I like that really the best. I am well content. I have concluded that life can go well for me. That maybe I'm finding a well life. I'm finding a good life. I'm well content. In weakness, he says, insults, calamities, and all the rest. So there may be places in your life today where you're deeply discouraged. And maybe you're disappointed in yourself. Maybe you're disappointed in God. Maybe you're in high school and you didn't get something you hoped for. Maybe you're in your early 20s and some things in your life or career aren't going exactly how you planned. Maybe you're in your 30s and you bumped up against some tragedy or unexpected struggle. Maybe you're in your 40s or 50s and by now you've made some mistakes and you're realizing you don't stand out in the crowd the way you thought you would. Maybe you're in your 60s or 70s and you have outright regrets and misgivings about your life. And we can get mad at God and we can hide and self-condemn. Or like Paul, we can grow well content with our weaknesses and pray, God, how might my life become a setting now where I might rely on your grace? How is this an opportunity for me to say with the Apostle Paul, your grace is sufficient for me? So one evening last week, I spent time praying for our church. Lisa and our dog Sammy had been kicked out of the house. No, not Lisa. Lisa kicked me and our dog Sammy out of the house because she was hosting a women's event at the church. At our house. I'm all confused. And I had lots to do, and I was going to go to the church office. But I decided I was moved to pray. And so Sammy and I went to a secluded place to pray. We actually just went to a parking lot, a dark parking lot. And we prayed, not just a short prayer, but a deeper prayer. And it was because I was moved to pray. And I discerned a thought in prayer. And I'm not going to say God said it, but I trust that He's the one who brought it to mind. But the thought was, I want to get out of the way. Okay, I'm praying about the church, and my thought was, I want to get out of the way. So that was a desire. It wasn't really a command. It was just a desire on my part. And I hooked that up to, I really want the Spirit of Christ to be strong in our church. So what I think I was realizing in prayer, and God was guiding me to see, was I don't want to rely on my activity or even your activity in what happens in this church. My deepest desire is to rely on visible signs of the Spirit of Christ. So, I go to an event like the Christmas tree giveaway, or the Great Pumpkin giveaway yesterday, and a lot of people have done a lot of really wonderful things. But I'm sort of looking and saying to myself, where's the Spirit at work, just like beyond all that? Where's the Spirit at work? I'm watching and listening. Where's the Spirit of God at work beyond what any of our people did, any of you did, any of the good stratagems that you applied to the situation? And I saw a lot of that. That's what the beauty of the thing was. It was way beyond us, in my view. And that's something where we have eyes to see. And I think it just hooks into my desire for a church. We are weak. We are, in a sense, every church is weak, but we're weak. Why do I say that? It's because that's the foundation for the place where the grace of God can be full and alive. And so we long for the Spirit. So I think what we're talking about is a shift happens. You start to long less that your future is bright, and we long less that the future of Community West is bright, and we start to long more that Christ's future is bright where we are and where we go. You understand the difference? So Christ's future is bright, not our future is bright. Whose glory do we really want? So Paul writes elsewhere in 2 Corinthians, we have this treasure in clay jars. What does he mean? He means we are just clay jars. We are crackpots. We are weak vessels in which the treasure is placed. The treasure is the light and the glory and the grace of the crucified Christ. And so if we're growing in Christ, we grow in this notion that we are weak and we are just crackpots in which the glory of Christ can be seen. I think that's a beautiful vision for what I long for Christ to be doing and encouraging in all of our hearts. So, do you dream of your glory, or do we dream together for Christ's glory? And now I'm talking about your deep down dreams. Your discouragement can help awaken you to wanting Christ's glory. You may not have weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities, but on the other hand, we do have insults at work or hardships at home or persecutions in our neighborhood. We do have calamities through sickness and experiences of what our children are going through. And Christ is saying to us today, and Janine, I'm going to invite you to come up. He's saying to us today, in the midst of your life, my power is ready to be made perfect. Not in your strength, but in your weakness. If you'll just receive me and trust me there. So I'm really asking you this morning, where are you struggling the most? Where are you discouraged? Where are you downtrodden? Christ is saying to you, it is there that you can find that my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. Let's continue to respond as the band leads. Respond to what the Spirit is stirring in you.